reading is taken from Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. The topic is Truth Invites, It Never Commands. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Free will is a basic principle of life. God never coerces. He invites us to live in such a way that we find fulfillment in ourselves. If we refuse to live rightly, Paramahansa Yogananda taught, God simply says, I will wait. We have eternity to live. In that eternity, we live as we choose. In self-created darkness, a darkness as intense and as long-lasting as we choose, or in the infinite light, the true self, which is God. Jesus Christ in the Beatitudes offered a beautiful example of God's way of inviting mankind to seek perfection, not by commanding, but by offering his human children the incentive they need to choose the right of their own volition. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus said, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. In each of the Beatitudes, Jesus explains the blessing attendant upon observing it. The divine way, similarly for each of us, is not to do violence to our own natures. Spirituality must be attained naturally. It can never be attained by force. The Bhagavad Gita says in the 3rd chapter, even the wise behave in accordance with nature, as it is manifested in them. Of what avail then is suppression? The scripture then goes on, however, to explain that this doesn't mean we should surrender to the dictates of our lower nature. Rather, it emphasizes our need to aspire to the heights, but each of us in accordance with his own nature and not in imitation of anyone else's, offering ourselves up for purification by divine grace. Desire, whatever form it takes, so the Bhagavad Gita explains, should be resisted, even if only mentally. Attachment and repulsion to sense objects, both of these are universally rooted. No one should accept their influence, for verily they are man's enemies. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind.
My name is Nayaswami Hriman from Gilloway, an Irish Swami, I might add, from Seattle. Originally from California, spent 15 years at Ananda Village, where my wife and I raised our children, and then later in 1993, Swami Kriyananda, our founder, asked us to move to Seattle to direct the work there, and we've been there 25 years. Time flies, and if you're a lot younger than me, don't forget, it flies. Life is short, make it work. Make it something powerful. So today's affirmation is wisdom, and our reading has to do with free will. And it's a curious topic, actually. I told the story yesterday at our pre-initiation. Some of you may have heard it before, but on the question of what is free will, after all, if we as sentient human beings can't both face, confront, and ask, what is the nature of suffering? Why do we suffer? What is evil? Then we haven't really lived. We haven't really been sensitive to the reality of life. And so this story comes from India, and Anandamoyi Ma, the woman saint featured in the autobiography of a yogi, was once asked, what is free will. Now, mind you, she was illiterate and at the same time deeply, deeply wise. If you ever read any of the books put together, she didn't write anything, obviously, but there are books with sayings and her philosophy, if you will. Very deep, very what we in yoga call jnanic. And she just, and people from all over India in her lifetime. She died in 1982, I think it was. Anyway, and she met Yogananda, as you know, if you've written the autobiography. And many people came to ask her abstruse questions of religion, philosophy, of daily life. And her response to this question of what is free will was a curious one. She said, it's like we live on a train. You know, in India, if you've been to India, and I've been blessed to travel the length and breadth of India, trains were one of the legacies of the British Empire, along with their language. And we'll put aside everything else they did, like steal and blind. But anyway, and she said, if you're on a train, you can go up and down the car, or cars, you know, inside, but you can't change the destination of the train. And so free will, what she was really saying is, free will is really, as Yogananda put it, is the choice between uplifting our consciousness towards God, towards spirit, towards truth, or going downward into egocentric behavior, destructive behavior, what have you, in any case self-involvement of various types, not all of which is necessarily bad, but it simply isn't expansive. Now, we in America, freedom is our watchword, and that's a wonderful and an entirely good thing. But spiritual freedom is of a different order than social justice, perhaps, or our rights. All of that is, who would possibly argue with that? Well, never mind. We know who would argue with that. But of course, those are necessary and right for the human situation. But spiritual freedom has more to do with, you might say, looking up, towards seeing, well, the golden rule, which is often a good start. But you know, it's curious, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you, can also be derived through logic alone. It's sort of like smoking or drinking or something. All the education and reason that we possess in this culture hasn't necessarily had that big of an impact on self-destructive addictive behavior, because behavior comes to us through the combination of what we bring into this lifetime from the past, how we behave in this lifetime, the multitudinous influences of our lifetime, parents, family, culture, etc., society, but also the degree to which we seek transcendence, ego transcendence, meaning I'm tired of just being my little self. I might have all the wealth one could possess, all the freedoms society can offer to me. America has, you know, if you study history as I enjoy doing, you look over history and you'll see that I don't think you can find a time on any country as the years, the decades, century or two of any country that's had relative prosperity, relative health, relative security, relative opportunity as in this country. But are we necessarily happy? It says in the autobiography of a yogi, he makes this one little quote. He says, for wisdom too, we have a hunger. Yes, we want to have a home, shelter, food, etc. Okay, no one's going to argue with that. But even when we have all of these things, our heart yearns for something greater. On a deep level, we know that we are part of a greater reality. I remember, and I bet there's some of you who had this experience, not uncommon at all. I remember saying my given name, which was Terry, over and over when I was a kid, and not just a kid. I could never understand what the connection was between those words and who I was. And some people, they're born into a family and they look around their family, fruits and nuts in this family tree. And, you just think, wow, how did I get here? You have to be born somewhere. But we are much greater, and we've had the privilege, and it's truly the privilege in this society, overall, generally speaking, the privilege to have the opportunities to think more deeply. If you're in the street, if you will, if you're burdened by addiction, substance abuse, or poverty, etc., it's very, very hard to reach deep into the heights of seeking. If you go to the ashrams of India, if you look over the history of the monasteries of Christianity, if you look a little, St. Francis was born of a wealthy family. Now, he walked away from that. Krishna was a king. We're blessed and privileged to have the opportunity to question life more deeply. And we should take that seriously. I think it was Martin Luther King who said something to the effect that if there is nothing in life that you would die for, then you aren't alive. Now, that may be a bit extreme, but of course, taking in the context of his life for which he died, that makes a lot of sense. But if we can't have passion in life that includes something more than our own personal reality, we'll never be happy. It's just that simple. I'm encouraged, I'm sure you are too, that society at large has begun to turn its attention towards what makes us happy. So now there are studies out of Harvard, and actually I don't know why you need studies out of Harvard, but it's just sort of how we think, We can figure out for ourselves what's making, when we're generous, when we're kind, when we think of other people, when we exercise and eat right, when we do the things that are in harmony with our true nature, we're happier. It's really not that complicated. Our choice in life, well, I was reading the other day, 82% of children have the political views of their parents. I don't really care that much about left or right. I mean, they all have their place if you have a certain amount of wisdom. But the fact is, our life situation, both prenatal and postnatal, makes, I have to pick somebody just right, but why do you wear that color? Or why did you have a banana, as I did, for breakfast? You can't really account for most things. How did you find your partner, your spouse? I mean, you could tell me the story, I could tell you my story, but it doesn't really tell us anything, okay? As they say in India, it is all karma. And Yogananda much preferred the American way, actually, in fact, because the Orient is known, at least historically, by the Europeans as being somewhat fatalistic societies. He much preferred the can-do spirit of America. It's no coincidence that the work of self-realization took place in America. He loved the expression, eventually, why not now? Quoting Americans in his days. And so, this bit about karma is not something we want to focus on. We do focus on freedom, okay? But, if you're going to attack another country with 7 soldiers, that's not very intelligent. So it's useful to know what we're up against with our karma. And our real freedom to grow spiritually comes from awakening to the divine presence, the divine will, the divine guidance, and living our life by those principles which are not unknown, love, wisdom, charity, etc. That's not so difficult. But it's really an inside job. It's not, most of you know the yamas and niyamas of Patanjali, the do's and the don'ts. We talked about God invites here in the reading and doesn't command. Well, I think some of us Christians would take exception with that. After all, we were given 10 commandments, don't you know? And sometimes people need that. Okay? But more people of more refined consciousness don't respond to commandments. so we've entered an age where we emphasize freedom and so forth, where we don't respond to that. Self-realization is no one can meditate for you, no one can love God for you, no one can love your neighbor for you. That's a matter of the heart. And so when this reading today talks about truth invites, doesn't command, it's talking about a more refined level of behavior. In Patanjali's do's and don'ts, the yamas and niyamas, more or less similar to the commandments. They're not placed as commandments, they're placed as actions which harmonize us with our true nature. But in actuality, if you survey most Orthodox faith traditions, what goes on in those places, etc., mostly it's about yamas and niyamas, commandments. In other words, eat right, don't slug your brother, all those sorts of do's and don'ts. But when we begin to grow spiritually, and as a person comes into adulthood and has gotten the do's and the don'ts from their mother and father, let's say, if they don't internalize those values and make it their own, they're just like a robot. They haven't really learned anything. And so it is spiritually, through meditation, where we can feel a presence greater than ourselves. When we clear the mind of the natural obstacles of our restlessness of body, mind, and emotions, then we perceive that greater self. And in the perception of that greater self, which has no name or form, it's natural to see all life as the very same as the self. And so we're moving into a time when more and more people like you and I and millions are seeking that inner state of consciousness that is truly what changes us. Gandhi is famous for saying, "Be the change that you seek in the world." It might seem that a work like Ananda's and other works similar to us that teach meditation and yoga might seem irrelevant to the issues of today. Well, that may be true. We don't tweet that much, and we don't make headlines. But the change in consciousness, somebody once wrote to Swami Kriyananda, it was years ago, and says, "Why don't you at your community get more involved with recycling?" Okay. He wrote back, if most of the world lived the life that we did, it wouldn't be an issue. We'd live sustainably. We'd be living in harmony with our planet, with the animals, with one another, and so forth. Because the real change, the real work that's happening in the world today includes and is very much centered on yoga. I don't mean only the true yoga is meditation, but the society uses yoga to point at the physical branch of meditation, not the yoga. It doesn't matter, because I know from many people all over the world that people start at the fitness gym doing yoga or yoga studio, and after a time, if they really, really do it well, they start to awaken to aspects of their own consciousness they didn't know existed. They become, it's like a little child. When I was a kid, I used to like Almond Joy. Okay? Now, if you give me one of those things, you just outgrow certain forms of behavior, being irritable, being a schmuck, as I like to say. Yoga, meditation changes you from the inside. You lose your taste for restlessness, for judgment of other people. I'd like to say it happens overnight. The room would be filled if it did, because you have to do the work, see? And that very much fits our American temperament. We want to work, maybe a little too much sometimes, but we're willing to do the work, is what I'm saying. And that's the key to it. But it's important to know what we're up against. And that's where we're going to have in a few minutes a discipleship initiation ceremony. So it's appropriate to say that, well, one time in a radio show, Swami Kriyananda was asked by, one of these people who try to get your goat, they do that on radio and TV. And he said, well, why, do I need a guru? This fellow asked Kriyananda. He just laughed. I think he thought to his own mind, you sure don't. But he was too polite to say that. He said, no, you don't need a guru. And then he looked down and paused. He said, unless you want to know God, unless you want to know freedom, soul freedom. And what's the expression we say? When the disciple is ready, the guru appears. When I was 25 years old, I went off to India, spent a year traveling up and down every ashram I could bump into. I came home empty-handed like Dorothy and Toto. And it was only then that I found the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda, and so forth. Because you don't need a guru until you realize you've tried everything. I remember trying to meditate on my own back in the 60s when I first started during college. I was like Forrest Gump, you know. I was there at the Berkeley riots. I was there on Haight-Ashbury. I didn't inhale though, and I lived in Monterey. I was at the Monterey Pop Festival, and I went off to India. I wasn't ready. I hadn't gotten to the point. So I tried to meditate on my own. I had a book or something. We didn't have anything back in the day, no internet, and none of those things. You had to go to a bookstore for heaven's sakes. And, but it didn't work. I meditate up and down India, and you know, through college, and through my career and stuff, and then I went off to India. It wasn't enough. And so you've got to do the work. Self-improvement, you know, I know some of you are involved with Unity locally. My wife and I do a lot of Sunday services by invitation from different Unity churches in the Seattle area and Church of Religious Science. They're very, you know, we're like friends, always have been for decades around the country. But, you know, self-help, though important and an important first step, it just isn't. I've been living in these communities of Ananda for pretty much all my adult life. And I see that we don't really change that quickly in our basic temperament, you know, whatever it is. I'll use the example of Republican and Democrat, or I mean, I could use a number of examples. I like sweets, I don't, you know. Those kinds of things, that's kind of the deck we've been given. But where we change is we soften, we open, we acquire new ways of expressing ourselves. But if you're artistic by temperament, it's not like you don't retain that. Yogananda was more of a bhakti, more by devotion, but his guru went more by wisdom. So Yogananda didn't become like his guru. The guru helps us to unfold in our natural way, just as the reading suggested. And it's so, you know, other people who don't understand these things say, oh, the guru, I don't want to be told what to do. They don't realize the guru doesn't tell you what to do. When you get to that stage, you welcome guidance. You're ready for it. You've tried everything on your own. So it's a stage of refinement of the soul's awakening to realize that which we aspire to be a Christ, to be happy, however you might express that, comes through a power, as they say in recovery, greater than our own. But unlike, you know, that general statement, if we are made in the image of God, why would we not imagine that somebody hasn't achieved self-realization? Why should we have to die to achieve it? Jesus himself was a great yogi. He said the kingdom of heaven is not low here, low there. The kingdom of heaven is within you. All that we seek is there. And the guru is simply a way shower who lives a life that we can see. We have stories, we have examples of how to behave under different circumstances. More than that, because most of us living today didn't actually, in our case, know Paramahansa Yogananda, but more than that, has the magnetism, the vibration of God consciousness with which we can attune ourselves. He doesn't need a true guru doesn't need body, but in order to help people, it comes in a body to maybe write a book or scripture or give a living example. I mean, Jesus didn't write the Gospels, right? So they do that, but their legacy is to draw divinity. When I was a Catholic boy, we genuflect when it's in the words of the Mass said, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us." Jesus, or as John says in the first chapter of his Gospel, he says, "And as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God." Jesus' retort to the accusation that he blasphemed in calling himself the Son of God, he quoted the Old Testament and saying, "Do not your scriptures say, ye are gods?" And so self-realization is coming to reawaken. It's in the Christian tradition even, but somehow there aren't eyes to see or ears to hear. The very fact, even reincarnation is right there. Jesus asked his disciples after the transfiguration on the mount, the first thing the three disciples asked him, they weren't very smart in a lot of ways, he scolded them frequently, but the first thing they asked was, well, where's Elias? They intuitively were told in the transfiguration experience that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. They didn't even question that. After all, they'd been with him. Instead, they asked, well, where's Elias? And Jesus said, Elias has come already, and they did to him what they will, which is St. John the Baptist. And he repeated that in a different instance. And I'm just touching a little bit of this, but it's there, and someday, to survive the onslaught of Eastern teachings, I can guarantee you, in a century or more, Christian tradition will recognize the teaching of reincarnation, and a great many other things too. It's right there. Their own saints testified to all of the above, but their theology has kept people where they want them. So it will change. It will change because the consciousness of souls on our planet has changed. So to understand that free will, that free choice, it's really the choice to go within and seek from above. And at some point, as many of you here have, felt being drawn to the ray of the divine light that is represented by this particular lineage. In God, they're all the same. They don't really argue, but it's like we're born in a family, we're born in a country. We need some practical way to express our aspirations. And so our spiritual family is our, you might say, higher family into which we're drawn back. It's not like it's anything new. No one can say anything to you that you don't already know. It's recognition. Patanjali says that the spiritual path is one of increasing steps of smriti, recollectedness, because tattvamasi, thou art that. Thou art the infinite spirit, a spark of the infinite, and to that we return. And the techniques of kriya and self-realization, meditation, are designed to awaken not just that memory, but the actual inner experience of transcendence. That's our free will. That's really the essence of it. So I better stop there. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm a guest, right?